Okay, this is the introduction, so you don't have to interpret this bit. The speech is about the 30 Years' War and about Sweden, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about either. I'll mention a couple of names. First of all, the Varangian Guard, that's Varangian Guard, and Constantinople, Byzantium, depending on what term you're more familiar with. And I'll talk about somebody called Gustavus Adolphus, who was a king of Sweden. And I think everything else should be fairly self explanatory. And I'll start in a few seconds. Dear colleagues, a short while ago, while I was doing some research on something completely unrelated, I found out that apparently in Poland, mothers still scare small children by telling them that if they don't behave, the Swedes are going to come and get them. I don't know whether this is true or not, and I don't know whether it actually has any impact on small Polish children and whether they eat their vegetables without complaining and go to sleep early because otherwise the Swedes will get them. Uh, by the way, if you're a small child, I definitely would recommend obeying what your parents say and going to bed early. Not that I did when I was a small child. More seriously, however, it's it's amusing to think that it's even possible to be scared of Swedes nowadays, or that Swedes could have a reputation that is somehow scary. I wouldn't want to insult anybody Swedish who's listening at the moment, but nowadays, if people think about Sweden, well, they might think about neutrality. They might think about a very well organized and efficient country, a very nice country. I suppose if they felt a bit uh, negative, they might feel that Swedes tend to be a bit bossy. I mean, there's, for instance, a rather famous small Swedish girl that goes around telling everybody how to save the planet, who's quite famous at the moment. And of course, like most Swedes, she's probably right. But again, uh, that's one of the cliches about Swedes, that they're possibly people who think they know better than you do and tend to be a bit bossy. I'm married to a Swede, so I couldn't possibly comment. However, one thing that Swedes are not is scary. The only scary thing in Sweden is if you buy alcohol and you look at the bill. But apart from that, as I said, Sweden has a reputation not only for neutrality, but for generally being a non scary country. So, where does this reputation in Poland apparently come from? Well, if you go back in history, of course, you will be aware that the Swedes, being Scandinavian, were also Vikings, same as the Norwegians and the Danes. In Western Europe, we tend to be more familiar with the Vikings that attacked Britain and Ireland and France and the whole of the coastline all the way down to the Mediterranean. Now, those Vikings tended to come from Norway or Denmark. The Swedish Vikings went east up the Baltic to places like Poland, the Baltic states, and the Ukraine and Russia. In fact, depending on how you interpret history, you can say that a lot of the early kingdoms in those areas, in particular the first kingdom in Russia, might have been started by people who could technically be tied into Swedish origin. But it's quite controversial, so I'm not going to start an argument with our Russian friends about that. The Swedish Vikings actually went very far east and also south. They went all the way down to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, apparently, and they went down to Byzantium, to Constantinople. Indeed, at one point, the elite soldiers of the Emperor of Constantinople, his personal bodyguard, were the Varangian Guard, who were mainly recruited from people we would nowadays call Swedes. However, The real reputation of the Swedes as scary people in Eastern Europe came during the 30 Years' War. Now, the 30 Years' War, as its name suggests, lasted for 30 years between 1618 and 1648. I'm not going to go into the details, but it devastated a large part of Central and Eastern Europe. And one of the great leaders on one side was Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden, who was a very, very far-sighted military commander and is still probably one of the great European military leaders if you study military history. And at that time, the Swedes had a fearsome reputation, and it's based on that that in parts of Eastern Europe, people still talk about them. And it's probably based on that, if it's true, that in Poland they used the threat of Swedes to scare small children. Times have changed a great deal, and as I've said, the Swedes don't scare you anymore. They just send Greta Thunberg to lecture you about the future of the planet, which is probably a good thing, unlike whatever they used to do during the 30 Years' War. Having said that, I recently read that the Swedish government has decided to start boosting defense spending because of the recent behavior of Russia, and that they're going to actually start improving their military. So who knows? The Swedes might suddenly start becoming scary again. And that might actually be a good thing. Thank you.